For the third session of the September 2024 Widening Virtual Training, we're joined by a journalist who stepped into the co-host role for a legendary radio show whose audience definitely has a vocal opinion and isn't afraid to share it. But Tonya Mosley's voice is as powerful as it is soothing, and she has earned wide acclaim as a journalist, entrepreneur, and a prominent media voice. Tonya is the co-host of NPR's Fresh Air and founder of TMI Productions. Previously, she was the co-host of NPR's midday program Here and Now, where she led daily coverage during the Trump administration, the pandemic, and the racial reckoning of 2021. On January 6, 2021, Tonya hosted live NPR special coverage of the insurrection as it was happening. And before Here and Now, she led a team of tech journalists as the Silicon Valley bureau chief for KQED in San Francisco. Tonya is also the creator and host of the award-winning podcast, Truth Be Told, and she has a name. Tonya, thank you so much for joining us today.
Rachel, thank you so much for having me, and I'm so excited to be in conversation with all of you.
So I'm going to start by asking you to do the same thing I've asked our other speakers to do today, and that is to give us that origin story. Tell us about your backstory and how you chose journalism as a career.
Yes, well, my story of what led me to being a journalist, I will say, it really started for me at a very, very young age. I actually don't remember a time where I didn't want to be a storyteller of some kind. And I always hesitate to tell this part, but it is important for you to know. I was a very dorky young kid in Detroit who was obsessed with the Detroit Free Press newspaper. And I would take clips and cut them out and then paste them on pieces of paper and sit them next to my word processor. This will just give you a sense of how long ago this was, a word processor, and retype them, so reword them, so rewrite these stories. And I fell in love with a journalist named Mitch Albom, who was a sports columnist at the time for the Detroit Free Press. He would go on to write Tuesdays with Morrie and some other novels, as well as host his own radio show and television show. And I was so enamored by his career. I thought, okay, here's a guy who's doing all the things. He's pouring his talent and his love of storytelling, not in just one medium, but several different mediums. And that planted a seed for me on the type of career that I might want for myself when I got older. And so I kind of linked myself to the Detroit Free Press when I was about 12 or 13. I'd write to their editor about stories that I saw in the newspaper on my little word processor, and they would write me back. And one day I got a letter asking me to be a part of a series about what young people think about the communities in which they live. And that really set off for me what would then become a long relationship with the Detroit Free Press and my love for journalism and my role as a journalist. I met Rachel Jones when I was in high school. I was an apprentice at the Detroit Free Press. I was in 10th grade, and she was paired with me as my mentor for that program. I went on to the University of Missouri Columbia for journalism school. At the time, it was the #1 journalism school in the country, and it was the only school that I applied to. And while I was there, I took a job as a production assistant at a local television station, and I really loved that work. I really loved the production of television along with the journalism. At the time, I was a print journalism major, and so this really changed my trajectory. And I moved from being a production assistant to then a producer, then an executive producer, and I moved through several markets throughout the country as a producer before switching on to become a reporter because I knew I loved also being out in the field. And I was a reporter for many years at several stations throughout the country. And then I became a correspondent for Al Jazeera America. And then I moved into radio as a host. So that's I'm skipping over a lot of different places, but that's basically been my trajectory. And I really could not see myself doing anything else but being what I like to call myself, a master storyteller, just using my skills as a storyteller in lots of different mediums, depending on where the story should live and how it can reach people.
Please don't think that I am trying to make this about me, because you should have seen the smile on my face when you mentioned my name. But
Yes.
I want you to tell the journalists about that moment, me advising you about
Yes.
something that happened at your high school.
Yeah. Well, I want to say, I mean, you guys, let me just take you back to like 1993, 94 with Rachel. She was this young, beautiful, just very dynamic reporter that I admired so much. And it was so exciting to have her as my mentor. And I just remember you being really no nonsense in a way that I admired, because at the time I was a very timid young person, just still learning my voice. And in 1994, my senior year in high school, there was a school shooting at my high school, and a classmate of mine, Frank Miles, was shot and killed right in front of the school. As it was happening, I was walking out of the school, and I saw him lying there. The thing that I remembered the most as we stood there waiting for paramedics to arrive was that the local TV station, one of the stations, Channel 2, Fox 2, their live truck arrived before police and an ambulance could arrive. And I was so angry about that. I didn't know until much later in my career how that came to be, that they just happened to be in the area at the time and they heard about the shooting on their scanner. But for me, it just further intensified what I thought was this very extractive way that the media interacted with my community, in a voyeuristic way. And so about a week or so later, I had my session at the Detroit Free Press with my mentor in the program, and I told them about my frustrations. I told Rachel, and Rachel said, "You should write about this. You should write about this immediately." So long story short, I wrote an article about that experience, and it ran on the front page of the Way We Live section, which was the feature section of the Detroit Free Press at the time. And what that experience did for me was plant a seed in me. Not only, at that time I had gotten a lot of advice and experience doing like straight ahead news stories and news briefs, but I had never done a story where I was also a part of the story. And that planted a seed for me, my understanding that in certain instances, it's really a major benefit to be a part of the story. If you have lived experience, if you can find a way to be able to offer that context and understanding, it's not just like reveling in your own experience, but there can be a real benefit to that. But I held that in my back pocket for many years. And as I gained experience over the decades, I've been able to draw back on that experience to understand my place in the stories that I tell.
Well, as I say, I'm humbled at that knowledge, but I've got a comment from one of the journalists. I think they're wanting me to wake up and stop making this about me. She says she's
No, but it's
so excited to dive into She Has a Name, as am I. But before we do that, I'd like you to talk about starting your own company, starting your own production company, and how that came about.
Sure. Well, it was unintentional, but I've come to understand almost a blueprint for, if you think about many of the journalists or storytellers that you admire that are multifaceted and move beyond, say, the medium or the particular company that they work for. So in 2019, I left KQED, where I was the Silicon Valley bureau chief, and I also was hosting a show called Truth Be Told. And I left to become a host for NPR for the midday show Here and Now. But KQED wanted me to continue to host Truth Be Told. So I continued to do that, and we made it a bi-weekly podcast instead of a weekly one. And the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, as you all may remember, there were lots of cuts within media organizations because they were really impacted by COVID. And KQED told me they could no longer produce Truth Be Told. Well, I had a good friend, Farai Chidea, who's a longtime journalist. I was on the phone with her telling her about this, and she said, you should buy it. You should buy the podcast from them. Even if you never continue on with the podcast, they're not going to do anything with it. They're just going to put it on the shelf. So I went to KQED and I said, I'd like to buy it. They at first said absolutely not, like this is our intellectual property, but I had an amazing intellectual property lawyer who just continued to hammer on it, continued to say, look, you're not going to do anything with it. The show is Tonya. She has crafted it essentially in her image because it's also so personal. So after several months, they said, okay, you don't even have to buy it. We'll give it to you. But in order for that to happen, I needed to have my own company. I wanted it to be under the umbrella of an LLC. And so I did that. And what was amazing about that was that from that moment on, I got foundations who came to me who said, we want to support your work. We want to continue to support Truth Be Told, the Ford Foundation and the Heising Simons Foundation. And from that, I was able to continue producing Truth Be Told, which is now grown, as you all mentioned, She Has a Name is another property under my production company. And that's how that began.
I am just going to, even though I've had a million questions, ask you to talk about She Has a Name. It's an incredibly powerful story, a premise to begin with, but I think that fellows will benefit from the process you went through to even come to the point where you wanted to share that kind of a story with the public. So could you walk us on that journey?
Sure. So She Has a Name is a 10-part series investigative podcast about the disappearance and murder of a sister that I never knew, Anita. Anita disappeared in 1987 and her body was recovered in 2020. I found out that I had a sister that I didn't know in the early 2000s when her son contacted me to tell me. And she's quite a few years older than me. She was my father's daughter, and I did not know my father. So when I received that call in the early 2000s, it's like many families who have, skeletons in their closet. I never thought about it being a story that I would end up telling. It was really about family reunification and learning about who I was. And for 20 something years, that's what it was. My nephew and I, we grew a bond. We became like family, and I got to know other parts of my family. And my nephew and I would spend for years, we'd be on the phone talking about his mother, what might have happened to her. And around 2015, 2016, he was watching the news and saw this program where you could give your DNA to Detroit police. And they would use that in this effort to try to identify bodies of people that they didn't have identification for, that they buried after finding their bodies. My sister was the first match in 2020. My nephew and I were having this conversation on the phone about it, and he said, Tonya, I'm just getting lots of calls from news reporters who want to tell this story, but I would love for you to tell it. And that's how we started on this path of telling the story. And I thought that the podcast medium was the best place to do it because there's an expansiveness there. We can go deep and narrow. There's no time clock. And so we've spent the last 2 years producing that story and learning about each other and learning about Anita and discovering lots of things that we didn't know.
Are you ever able to prepare for the emotional impact or intensity of sharing a story like that? What impact has it had on you?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I'm still processing it, quite honestly, Rachel. You guys, all of you know, as journalists, you get deep into a story and you're focused on drawing out all of the elements of that story. And for me, because I've been a journalist for so long, I knew how to do that like the back of my hand. And I really was able to compartmentalize during the process my own grief, so that I could be there for my nephew. That's where the centering of my grief lied. And I had that experience with people that I interview every day. Like, that is my role, is to open up space, to be able to hold that grief, to not make it about me, so that I can be able to impart the story and tell the story accurately. And so I really did sit in that space for a really long time. And I had great producers who were working with me to draw out my side of the story. But really, I did that thing we do where we can separate ourselves. But it was towards the end of the storytelling, when we got to the end of the production, that I couldn't really hold that separation any longer, because I had to sit with myself. I wasn't deep into all of the production elements of the story. And I really have been in a deep place of mourning for Anita and her life and what it has meant for me and my family. And also hearing from listeners who tell me, like, me too. Like, it's not the same story verbatim, of course, but in my family, I've lost someone to murder or missing person, or this element of myself that I didn't know I had, or the trauma of living in a city like Detroit and having to hold back the things that you experienced and saw and not bring that as your full self into your work. I've heard from lots of journalists who say that, like, it's a really big challenge for them to be in spaces where there are these stories that are mirrors of their own stories, and they're working with people who only see these stories in an anthropological way. Like, I get lots of questions on how are you able to bring that to the table while also like holding your professionalism. So all of that I've been working through over the last few months and giving myself grace as I work through it.
I love you using the term giving yourself grace. I see so many young journalists, primarily young women journalists, who don't make that space in their lives. They're putting so much pressure on themselves to achieve and to stand out and to beat back the voices. So thank you for sharing that.
And
I
I was too. I'm not trying to be like I'm some like I have all the answers.
no, but I mean, that's the first step to me, is giving yourself that grace. I
Yeah.
don't have all, and I'm goodly few years older than you. I need you all, anybody who wants to ask a question, to raise a Zoom hand or let me know. I'm going to ask one more before we get to your questions, and that is, during our conversation, you talked about the impact of stepping into a role like the co-host of Fresh Air, and the audience that you speak to every day. Um, Give us some or some insight into what that's been like for you, woman of African descent, stepping into this audience that's sort of hardwired in its own identity. Tell us about that.
One of the, I guess, like one of the really powerful and great things about doing radio, and also it's also a challenge, I should say, but it's a positive in this respect, is that there's an intimacy to it and a solitude to it that allows me to block out the noise, because it's just me and a microphone, and oftentimes many of my guests are remote, and even my staff, the folks that I work with, are across the country. And so I'm based in Los Angeles, and the majority of the team members are in Philadelphia. So I'll say in the beginning, being on this show, hosting Fresh Air, it was just me and the content. And that was really great for me, because it allowed me to really focus in on that and not the other distractions. And the distractions, I'll say, are one of the amazing things about Fresh Air is that it's a show that's been on the air for 50 years, and it's been hosted by one woman, the amazing Terry Gross, and there's no one like her. Audiences for public radio are longtime listeners, and they love familiarity. So having someone new like me come into that space, I've had a lot of hate mail. I had a lot of people who said, like, I don't fit. because they're used to one type of person hosting the show for a very long time. I think that me 10 years ago, even maybe 5 years ago, would have been deeply, deeply impacted by those messages and that messaging overall. But I think my age, as well as my experience, and like really, I'm in this stage in life where I'm me and like I'm sitting in who I am and I actually know my worth and I know what I bring to audiences. The bigger challenge for me is making certain that like I see all the faces that I see here, like what I can do to make folks feel like this is a show for them, because I am representing us and I'm representing a large contingent of the population that would love to interact with a show like Fresh Air and listen to a show like Fresh Air, or listen but would love to see themselves reflected more. And so I try to sit in that space knowing that that is a great part of where my worth lies. And I'm a benefit for those who don't look like me, to be able to learn about things that they don't know about, or hear about subjects they don't know about, or just hear about it from the perspective of me, because Terry offers her amazing perspective, the way that she comes at interviews as a person of her identity. And now I'm of a younger generation and a woman who's had experiences that are not like hers. And I've been hosting the show for a year and a half now, so that's still really early. I'm like, that's not a lot of time. So we're still finding our way, but it's been really gratifying.
Let's see if there are any questions. I don't see any Zoom hand. Oh, there we go. Maher, introduce yourself.
Hi, Tonya. So nice to meet you. Thank you so much for talking to us. It was really inspirational hearing you talk about your career and doing that incredible story that you did, which is also so personal at the same time. I am currently an associate producer at Al Jazeera at Fault Lines. Yeah, so I just wanted to talk to you about, I noticed that you said that you started your education in print journalism, then you were in television, and then you continued on to radio and podcasting, and you do a lot of production work now. How do you juggle between the different platforms? I've also worked in broadcast, print, and now I'm in the digital and broadcast space again. So I'm wondering how you juggle between the different platforms, and if you have a preference for one, and how to maintain your skills in all of them. I think that's my main question. Yeah.
Yeah, well, nice to meet you, and thank you for that great question. I don't have a preference. I do love, I love the visual medium. I think that it's powerful, and that because we're all on our phones, it allows a place, like it's the most democratic, like it's the best touch point for folks. Like you can tap into visual in a way that allows like that expansiveness of reaching various audiences. But I'm trying to think about the way to answer your question, like how do I maintain the skills, or how do I juggle from one to the other? I think the story dictates that for me. And I think when you can think about it, like what is the best medium to tell this story, that allows you to juggle from medium to medium. I'll give you like a great example. When I first step into a story, I'm thinking about it in three ways. I'm thinking about what are the visual components of this story, what are the auditory elements of the story, like what is it about this place and this space that I'm in that will really grab the listener, that is the most important part of the story for the listener. When I'm thinking about print, I'm thinking about what's enjoyable for me to read. What's the thing that's going to make me step into the story as a reader? And so I'm thinking about all of those things. And I always call it like pre-editing. Before I step out into the field or before I step into any subject, I'm asking myself those questions. I'm kind of looking at where is this story going to live along all of the platforms after we've decided what the story is. And then I move in that direction. I think that oftentimes, and I see it every place that I've ever worked, and I try to bring this sensibility when I do step into these new places, is that it's really hard on the other side of it to come to that. Like, it's hard after you have conceptualized the story, you've already figured it out, you've done all your reporting, to then come back and sit down and say, oh, okay, what are the visual components of this story? What are the ways that it can work in the audio form? And what are the ways it can work print and digitally? Like, that is the wrong way to do it, because by then, like, it's an afterthought. And so it's never going to have all of the gripping parts for all of those elements. But again, it really depends on the story. And you'll find the more you do it, like, reps are really important. I think I stepped into journalism right as the multi-platform journalist came to be. Like, the existence of that, 98, 99 is when I was first being asked as a television reporter to also write my stories for print, to also do something for social media. Those were all things that I was being asked to do. And so, because I had all these extra elements, I thought, well, I need to figure this out at the beginning. It's nothing worse for me than being a reporter, and at the end, I'm being asked to do all these extra things. I would like to get them, like, understand where I'm going to do them along the way so that I can have a smooth ending and, like, really focus in on the story. I hope that was helpful and not just a meandering.
No, thank you so much. That was super helpful. I think often in the industry, we're kind of told that having a multi-platform sort of experience is a bit of a weakness, but it's really cool to see you, talk about it more as a strength and, like, being able to tell different stories through different mediums.
I also want to just tell you this. And so right now I'm working with Fresh Air to deepen our visual presence online. And this is an open, it's nothing that's a secret. And we'll probably write about it in the future, but I had a lot of obstinance to that. Like, we are a radio program. People tune in for that intimacy, and that's true. But there's also this edict that we have been trying to fulfill for so long, and that is to grow audiences, to bring younger people and more diverse audiences to the table. And what they've been doing for 20 years hasn't worked. So you have to think about what is going to work. So when I joined Fresh Air, I visit Detroit, my hometown, often, and I was visiting a lot this past year because I was producing She Has a Name. And every time I talked to people, they'd always say to me, they were so interested in the work that I was doing in Fresh Air, meaning like the interviews that I was conducting. I might talk about the person I was talking to, and they'd say, where can I watch that? Where can I see it? Well, you can't see it. You need to go to this podcast, or you need to go to this radio dial that you don't have any, like, history with. You don't even know what this, you've never listened to it. Go here and then go to this other, and a lot of people didn't know what podcasts were. Go to this place you've never been, these two places to find it. Well, they're not going to do that. But if I show up on their feed as a video, as a beautiful, intimate conversation that's a visual, that has a visual component, that allows them, maybe they won't ever step into that radio medium, but it allows them to connect to what we're doing. And so it's an experiment, but, like, what else do we have in this moment of constricting audiences,
It looks like Brianna has her hand raised.
I do. Hi, I'm Brianna Rice. I work at Michigan Public, and I have loved listening to you on Fresh Air. I live in Detroit, and I was out of town last time you were here for the She Has a Name event. So I'm just so excited to be talking with you right now. But yeah, I guess I just want to talk a little bit more about this transition to such a personal story. I know it feels so intimate, all the other work you've done in interviewing, but, like, this is, like, a completely different thing. I feel like telling, like, all your family business and just having this narrative this way. I want to, like, hear a little bit about, like, how you transition to that work, but also, like, how you make space for it in your life when you have, like, a full-time job, like, all this other work that you're doing, like, how literally you do a project like this, because I loved it. So thank you.
Well, hopefully we can meet in person. I'm in Detroit often, so.
Oh my God, I would love that. I'll send you an email.
Okay, that's great. So I get asked that question a lot. Like, one of the things about telling this particular story is that it's an element of my life, but it's not my life. Like, it's personal, but it's, I mean, there are levels of personal here. And This one, I'm going to say something that sounds really woo-woo, but I also have a little bit of woo-woo in me, just to let you know that. And that is, when there's a story that really needs to be told and all of the elements stack up to tell it, I feel like oftentimes the universe conspires to make it happen. And in this particular case, I actually look back on the last 2 years and I say, how did that happen? Not only do I have a full-time job, I also have 2 children and I'm married. So I have a lot going on in my life. But the production of, I'll say the folks that we hired to help me work on She Has a Name were phenomenal. The production was smooth because we had a plan in place to really factor in my work for Fresh Air. And it was a story that just poured out of me, and my nephew was ready to tell it. And all the folks who were part of the story were ready to tell it. We did have some challenges along the way. Mostly my sister disappeared in '87, so that's a long time ago. So really finding people, the characters that needed to be a part of this story were the biggest challenge, because that was a long time ago, and getting, researching and getting documents that had long been destroyed. But when you have a story that you have the bones for the story, you have the deep desire to tell it, and you have in your heart and soul, like it needs to be told in that moment, oftentimes, like it does come together. So I'll just say that's what happened. It may not be helpful, but yes.
Are there any other questions before I jump back in? I don't see any Zoom hands. I want to ask you about podcasting in general. Obviously, for me, starting back in 1986, print was everything. I mean, that's all I wanted to do. I was telling them in the earlier session that my lifelong goal for many years was just to write a local column in a local newspaper. Mm-hmm. But where are we now at this moment in media when it comes to podcasting really conveying what people want and need to hear in a profound way? What would you say about that?
I think that the popularity in podcasting and just people being storytellers on social media, on TikTok, on YouTube, they are tools that allow people to tell their own stories. And I think that in this moment, we're at this time where we're thinking a lot about, like, when you started in the 80s and print was king, you also knew you had to go to an institution in order to get experience. So there were no other outlets where you could be a singular storyteller and you could go off and be able to do it in another way. You needed an institution to be able to do that. I think we're in this really interesting time where there's an influx of storytellers, and that how do you monetize it? That's like a thing that I think a lot of us now have to think about as journalists, something that we that really can get in the way of being able to tell the story, because you have to think about all the parts of it, but it can also be a plus because you can understand your audience better. So I'm trying to think about, like, what you're asking. You're asking, like, in this moment of time, what is the power of being able to have those particular mediums? Like, yes. I think it's tremendously powerful because it should, in the best way, allow institutional media, mainstream media, to understand that, like, their place, because you can get lots of things from lots of other places and lots of people, but like where their place is, and for people who want to tell their stories, whether they have 5 people who are listening or 500,000, it allows them that space to be able to do that, which I think just puts us in another place as institutional media organizations on, like, what our roles are. And I don't have answers for that, except for to say that I think I'm invigorated by it. Like, I feel like it's a challenge that I want to be a part of, understanding and helping to solve, where we understand our place and we also can open up space for more people to be able to tell their stories because they're already able to on their own through these platforms.
I want to talk to you about building your brand as something that, I'm never married, don't have kids, but it sometimes feels like the effort that it takes for me to try to do an Instagram post and a face and all of this other stuff to try to amplify or whatever. It's a lot. And so I wonder what your approach to being mindful about doing that is when you're so busy with your life.
I really feel for younger people coming into this industry to have to think about that from the start, because I think that for you and I, as social media became a thing, we were already well established in our careers and our understanding of the craft and our voice. So then when this component of, oh yeah, and now you've got to kind of promote yourself on social media came along, it was a bit easier for me. I still have a challenge in that like there's like the trendy stuff to do, and then there's like who you are. And I've just sat in this place of I can't be anyone but me. And so if that's going to be trendy, if that's going to end up being the it thing, then that's great. If it's not, then I just can't try to be like, I can't be doing dancing TikTok videos or anything like that. But I think that it should be secondary to a journalist, like when they think about holistically what they need to do. I think that your story is king, your craft is king, and through you really focusing in on what your voice is in your craft, I think it allows you to understand what your persona is online. It like just will come easier for you. If you notice on my social media, I think I do a lot of things. I either promote what I'm working on that I'm really interested in, my interactions with the people that I am interviewing, and the things that I love, my family, my hobbies, my intersections with other media makers, and each person will find for themselves what that is. I'll also say we're kind of on social media anyway, like passively as consumers. I don't know about you, Rachel, but like, I'm laying in my bed at night looking at TikTok videos. I am. And so I think about like what I want to, if I'm on there, I can also be contributing to it as well, but as my authentic self.
That's the perfect way to put it. And I feel like that's been my focus as well, in terms of not so much trying to get followers, but just if you see my Instagram, you get a sense of who I am. Let me ask you about something that I've bragged about and told people about through the years. It's just this incredible group of women who are now at the top of the media landscape, and who all came from Detroit in a moment when I was there, and it has nothing to do with me. But what I would like you to talk about is that energy or the sense of place of coming up in Detroit in that moment in time. And if you feel like there's any sort of synchronicity in the fact that you all are, you and Jamel and Jamila and
Kelly, yeah.
Kelly, and
Yeah.
talk about that.
I think it's a result of the mentorship from the Detroit Free Press, honestly. I think that program, the Detroit Free Press apprenticeship program, along with, there was a newspaper called Motown Teen that was produced by the Detroit Free Press and a woman who was, I think she was at the University of Michigan, and she just had this idea of doing a teen newspaper. And Jamil, along with Kelly and myself, were founding members of that newspaper, and it would come out like once every few months, and it had its own newsstand. We'd write about everything that was happening in our lives and the city. I think my first story for that newspaper was about Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas being nominated to the Supreme Court, and abortion rights. And think about like all of those are topics that are deeply of the moment today. Allowing a space for us to understand our voices and deepen our points of view and our voices through journalism, I think was the thing and I think that it could have happened anywhere. I do think Detroit was a very special time during that time period, but I really do think it was the mentorship of you and the others at the Free Press that really allowed that to happen. That's why programs like this are so important, but I think that also how old we were. We were teenagers who had a love of writing, who had a love of expression, and that was cultivated. We were told, I remember feeling like I was a real journalist. When you told me, write about it, and then I had that byline in the Detroit Free Press, I was a working journalist, and that was like 17 years old. And that was a gift that allowed me the confidence to continue.
I want the fellows to remember that in your own lives and careers, you have the power to do that, and I would think, the responsibility. I believe Sade has her hand up.
Yes, hello. I'm Sade. I'm at KERA in Dallas. I'm an on-demand producer. Podcasts mostly, but things are changing in my station. So I really appreciated this whole conversation, but I appreciated earlier when you were talking about audience development and folks who look like us who don't have that, who aren't the traditional public radio or public media audience. My question for you is just how do you recommend we go about convincing leadership that excuse me, how do we go about convincing leadership that we have to really, kind of like you were saying, meet people where they are and like really commit to doing that? Like yeah, I hope that makes sense, that first part.
100%, yeah.
Okay. And then the second part of that is, how do we go about keeping leadership accountable when they say they want to do these things? How do we make sure they like do it in the end? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sade, for those questions, which are really good ones. They're kind of like the questions. So one of the things that I've done throughout my career, and the fact is it's work, it's hard work, but I found it to work for me, from like a very small thing like pitching a story to something really big like pitching a show. I am always over prepared in every sense of the word, all the way down to my data collection. So when I created Truth Be Told at KQED, the one major hurdle was that they said they were open to me hosting my own show in the form of a podcast. And if I came up with a proposal, they would take a look at it. So that's the biggest hurdle, right? So I thought, okay, I want to create a podcast, but I really want to create something that hits, that actually serves our audiences, and is also something that I really want to do. So I held 3 focus groups, community focus groups. I held one in San Francisco. I was going to be in Los Angeles for something else. So I got some friends and I said, can you help me? My friend had a space. I said, can you help me put together something where we could have a focus group and have like some light food and have people come? And I did the same thing in Detroit. And at all 3 places, I had people the folks I wanted to be talking to, Black and brown people of a certain age. I also did one in San Jose, California. So I did 4 focus groups. And in each of those, I pitched to them the idea for the show, and I got feedback from them on what they wanted for a show like that. And also what I learned were some of the conceptions and misconceptions they had about KQED. It was a great focus group for me to understand what they thought of the brand and what they thought of public radio. And I gave those insights along with my pitch to the higher ups and said, here's the show that we should craft, and here's why it's needed now. And I also, because this is all public record, especially if you are working in public media, like they do focus groups and they have numbers, and what shows are doing well among what demos and what audiences they still need to capture. And I use that to say, here's the audience that you've been trying to capture for a really long time, and here's what they're telling us. And it was almost to a point where it's a pitch that couldn't be denied. And if it was denied, here's where I sit in this. I'm not saying that there's not frustration along the way and over the years that I've had, and just because we all have those. But if you do all that work and they say no, it's just not the place for it. It's not the place for that work. It's like, that's also information needs to know that, like, this is not going to happen there. I'm not telling you then you quit a job or anything, but you just know, like, this is not the place for this really important idea. Holding folks accountable, I think, is a really challenging thing, but making certain that when you are crafting all that stuff, you have an ally who has a significant place in the company that you're working for. So in my case, I had allies who were senior editors who I had them along for the ride. Like, every step that I took when I did these focus groups, I would notify them. I'd ask them their input. It's important while you're giving that you also allow folks who might be at a place for a while and have ideas or just mirrored down by it, but they hold some power, to be a part of that collective process. And so they can be part of making certain that they continue with it. But ultimately, it's up to the folks who run a company, whether or not they keep up with it. But as long as you have more people the more people you have at the table, the more likely that something like that, like an idea, they'll be held accountable to the changes that they make, and hold them for a longer time than something like just a special or short term or fiscal cycle.
I see that Nushrat has her Zoom hand raised.
Hi, Tonya. Thank you so much for being here and sharing all of your experiences. I work at the Detroit Free Press, so it's very exciting to hear you talk about the apprenticeship program. I just messaged my editor who runs the program and has been for the past years. I'm like, oh, we have someone who was in the program, and she's talking so highly of it, and she got really excited. So it's really great to hear you talk about the Free Press in that way, because I think there are still a lot of really good people, obviously going through hurdles, but still a lot of really good mentors there. But my question to you was about, so you talked about this experience you had when you were younger, when, the Fox 2 ban rolled in, and you felt like that was an extractive, thing that was happening. That's something that I think about a lot, especially when I have to cover like shootings and I'm pulled into covering, knocking on people's doors, etc. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about, after that experience, how you ensured that you weren't engaging in extractive practices as a journalist, and then what advice you have for us if we are pulled into these types of assignments.
Yeah. Well, so nice to meet you. And when I was young, there was nothing more. My number one dream was to be a Detroit Free Press reporter. So, yeah, I mean, that's such a great question, because I was a local television reporter for many years. And so I had that was my role. I was a crime and courts reporter. I would knock on people's doors all the time and show up at shootings all the time. And I carry with me my humanity and my understanding as someone who has gone through gun violence, not just that incident in high school, but in other incidents throughout my life. I think that understanding, that pushing back against editors and producers who might have sort of a template for what stories like that should be. You, as someone who is out in the field, you're interacting with these people, you're seeing what's happening with the story. You are the one who guides that story. You are the one to let your editors know, this is not what it is, or this is what I'm going to be doing. This is how I'm going to be interacting with community members. I think there's enough understanding now that some of the practices from 20 years ago, 30 years ago are frowned upon, but I'm sure many of those tactics are still used. And I have come to this place where I'm not always sure if, I'm no longer, I think that there's very little worth in journalism that right after a shooting happens, you go talk to a family member about that person or about what happened. I think that is exploitative. And I think that we do, in those news briefs, we do need to know who the person was. But I think that is such a vulnerable state for people that no matter how much empathy you have, it's just icky. I would love to talk with you online if you want to. I'd love to know more about some of the things you may be experiencing when you're out in the field and you're having to cover those stories. today, because I haven't been out in the field in that way in a while. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love that. Because I think we have really, I think the last time this happened, there was a shooting at a block club here in Detroit, and this isn't my beat, but oftentimes we get pulled, all of the reporters get pulled if it's a major shooting that happens. And so I had to do door knocking, and I always feel icky about it. We were able to have a really helpful and productive conversation with editors afterwards, so they are listening. But the sentiment has always been this is something we have to do. It's our duty as journalists. So it's something that I'm constantly thinking about, because it's sad to say there's going to be another shooting, there's going to be another tragic incident, and we're going to have to do that. And so I'm always thinking, how do I prepare myself? How do I make sure I'm not causing more harm to families? But yeah, thank you for that. I would love to kind of chat more afterwards.
Harm to families, and also, what does the community need to know? What do they need to know about it? And when we're trying to get sound bites about, from family members, is that for our competitors, or is that for the story and for the community? And I say competitors because oftentimes it comes down to that. Okay, I talked to the mother of so-and-so, and I need to get that person because I'm afraid my competitor across the street is also going to talk to try for that mom. But is there value in seeing a person screaming and crying and over their loved one? And are they giving value to the story and humanity to the person in the way that you need for that story? Those are questions. Yeah.
I want to, because we have you, and I want to ask you this question because it is so much a part of my own personal journey, and I'm sure obviously women like you who've achieved what you've achieved, and that is this whole issue of imposter syndrome. I battled with it, and I think I've told people that when I turned 50, I just got tired of not giving myself grace and not believing in myself, et cetera, et cetera. But people look at you and your career and your success and your platform and what you've accomplished, and they may walk away with a set of preconceived notions about what you've been through, who you are, and how you feel. So I wonder if you could give the younger women on this call some advice on how to give yourself that grace and navigate those potential moments where you probably doubt yourself more than you should.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think imposter syndrome is normal for all of us at some point. I know there are some people who probably don't have it, but I think to a certain extent, no matter what your identity is, there comes a point in your life where you are feeling, because you're new in whatever environment that you're stepping into. Maybe you're inexperienced, or you're with a population of people that you've never been in, or all of those things. I think it's especially true for people of color. And when I first started, the challenge for me being in television was that there were all these other components: my voice, my diction, my hair, my weight. And those were all things in addition to my journalism that I was always thinking about, and it was always at the forefront of my mind, and I was always presenting. I almost a persona in order to be able to move through, because I was constantly getting notes on me as a person. And so for many years, I did struggle with that. And the way that I was able to offset that was this trying to make sure I was just better than everyone else. I was the first one in the office and the last one to leave, and working on the weekends. And that's not something that I would suggest. But I think overall, we're kind of hardwired based on our experiences to give more, to be to try to be the smartest person in the room. And I think that understanding that there was this thing that, again, this is going to get really woo-woo, but there was this thing I heard this psychologist say about, we are always taught that we are presenting ourselves for others, and we're also caring for others as you move through different stages in your life. If you go into parenthood or you become a spouse, you're always thinking about someone else outside yourself. But the only person you really are accountable to is you. Like, you're the person that you have to care for. You're there to care for you. And so when I was able to, at a certain point in my life, I would say my mid-30s, because I think my mid-30s were a really important, that was a very important age for me, because I think I had the reps as a journalist enough to know that I was pretty good at what I was doing. So I wasn't the newbie in the room. I was becoming like the mid-career person. But somewhere in my mid-30s, I understood, like, oh yeah, I'm the only one looking out for me. And if I'm the only one really looking out for me, and I'm not really looking out for me, I'm trying to be this thing that everyone else wants me to be, and I'm trying to impress other people versus like following what my core is, my intuition, my expertise, then I'm just going to fail me. And that was really a sad thing to think about. And so I think that oftentimes in this vein, you've got to fake it till you make it. There are some times where you may not feel as confident. You may feel like an imposter in the room, but you have to keep saying to yourself, I may feel like I'm an imposter in this room, but I'm also the person that cares about me the most in this room. And if I'm the person that is in charge of looking out for me in this room, forget this imposter thing. I got to give it my all, and I've got to also be doing what's in the best interest of me while also serving the greater good of everyone else and those that I'm working with.
If there aren't any other questions, I don't see any other Zoom hands. So I just wanted to draw us to an end of this conversation by sharing with you that one of the reasons I'm grateful to have this opportunity to run this program is that I hope I'm giving the journalists the tools to build a vision for their career, to be able to see what they think they might want to be 5 years, 10 years from now, whether they even want to commit to this industry for that long. And so I'd like you to send us off with your vision for your career, what you'd like to have people say that you brought to the game, and where you want to be, say, 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
I see myself as a master storyteller that is continuing to grow, continuing to learn. What's so amazing about getting older is that you just learn about how much it is you don't know. And that's actually very exciting for me as a journalist, because we get off on more information, right? Like, we're all voracious learners. We want to know more. We want to be more. And so to come at this point in life and understand, like, oh, all the stuff I thought I knew, that's like just a drop in the bucket. There's so much life to live. That is where I'm sitting right now. As a master storyteller, that means that I have no bounds. Yes, I'm a host right now. Yes, I'm a podcaster. What other ways can I tell stories and serve communities? And I would say for all of you to think about yourselves that way if you want to. Meaning, like, there may be some of you who say, I'm a writer, and I know I'm a writer, and I'm nothing else but a writer, and I feel passionate about that, and that's what I want to do. And if that is what you're telling yourself, is that what you know about yourself, then you follow that. But I think that I'm at this point where I'm just following my internal compass and my voice. And so 5 years from now, I hope to be doing fulfilling work and serving the people who want to hear from me. And I don't know, that could look a myriad of ways. It's not one place, but and there is no destination. I'll also say that when I was a really young kid who knew I wanted to be a journalist, meeting Rachel for the first time, typing out Mitch Albom articles, there might have been a point where I said, oh yeah, I ultimately want to do this thing. But I realize now that, like, there is no destination, because the world is changing so much. The world is not the same as it was when I was young, and it'll continue to change. And I just want to move through time and be there for those moments as a storyteller, to be able to capture them and share them with folks. So thank you so much, Rachel. It's like I'm calling back to my 15, 16, 17-year-old self and thinking this is just more than I could have ever expected, to be able to be talking to all of you young people who are doing amazing work, and then being in conversation with you, Rachel, Thank you so much for being a mentor for so many people and helping us in our careers. And yeah, thank you.
It has been a powerful privilege to speak with you about your career, about your podcast, but about your vision and your energy and your spirit, Tonya Mosley. So thank you so much for joining the Widening the Pipeline family, and we will be in touch.
Yes, thank you.